Okay, well, let's start our session. Welcome, everyone. My name is Raja Khoury. I'm the CEO of the Khoury Conversations. And we welcome you all to today's webinar titled Israel and the Nakba at 75. As usual, we will start, we Canadians start with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we are on indigenous land and territories, known and unknown. We respect indigenous peoples as the original stewards of this land and the enduring relationship that they have with it and the traditional territories. As settlers and immigrants, we recognize that we have an active role in reconciliation. Welcome, everyone. I'd like to thank and acknowledge the Ottawa Forum in Israel, Palestine, and its chair, Peter Larson, who's with us today. He's supporting our Zoom platform and sponsoring it. And we'll be looking, monitoring the questions in the Q&A. Thanks to all of you for joining us from across the world, from here, Canada, United States, Latin America, Europe, and the Middle East. Regular participants know that Khoury Conversations are dialogues and not debates. We seek understanding and not winners and losers. We seek insight and understanding. It's been brought to my attention, we have inadvertently scheduled this webinar on the day of the Jewish holiday of Shavuot, which commemorates the delivery of Torah to Moses on Mount Sinai, and which formed the basis of the Christian holiday of Pentecost. We regret the oversight which may have prevented some people from participating, but this session is being recorded and we hope that will help. Now, the format to have today is, the webinar is in two sections. The first one is a sort of historic to contemporary look at, where we are today. The second section will be a future one, and we'll look at, where might we go from here. 75 years is a long time, and we hope we will not be celebrating too many anniversaries that are at its standstill or stalemate as we are today in the history of that struggle. Now, as I mentioned, this session is being recorded. The chat box is open for you to interact respectfully if you wish to, but the Q&A is where we'll be looking for questions. So any questions you want to make, please put them in the Q&A box, and the chat box is available. We have an amazing panel today, a panel of distinguished experts, and we were very lucky to be able to have all of them with us on the same day at the same time and the same place. Their full bios are on our website, khouryconversations.org. I will mention briefly the current sort of titles, but for details, please go there to the website, khouryconversations.org, and in the interest of time, we'll just do titles today. Here they are in order of appearance, as they say. Rami Khoury is the co-director of global engagement at the American University of Beirut, a professor of journalism and journalist in residence at the AUB, and a non-resident senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. Derek Pensler is the William Lee Frost Professor of Jewish History at Harvard University and the Samuel Zaks Professor of Jewish History Emeritus at the University of Toronto. Shibli Telhami is the Anwar Sadat Professor for Peace and Development and the Director of the University of Maryland Critical Issues Pole. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. And last but not least is Mira Sukharov, who's professor and associate chair at the Department of Political Science at Carleton University, and the author or editor of 5 books, including most recently Borders and Belonging, a memoir. And as Fareed Zakaria would say, now let's get started. So starting with Rami Khouri, some context, and each question we're posing today can have a 2-3 day conference to address it. We're asking our experts here to do it in 10 minutes. So, good luck in advance, and I thank you for trying to keep it as short as possible so that we can have some conversations. So Rami, 75 years ago, Palestinian society was destroyed, uprooted, scattered, an event known to Palestinians as the Nakba, or the catastrophe. Another calamity to Palestinians took place in 1967, which was known as the Naksa, or the setback. Palestinians see themselves as continuing to lose land on a daily basis through confiscations, building of settlements, attempts at annexation, etc. Now, throughout these 75 years, Palestinian resistance has never abated, and to Palestinians today, to resist is really to exist, and to exist is to resist. Where does that Palestinian stand today, in your perspective?
Thank you, Rajan. Thank you to our panelists for being here. I think this will be a very useful and instructive discussion.
Excuse me, Rami, can you speak up a little bit or come closer to the mic? You sound a little...
All right. Is that any better, or should I put on a headphone?
It's better.
Better. Okay. So thank you to the panelists for being here, and you, Raja, for organizing this, and all the audience who's attending. I think we're going through a really significant moment historically for the Palestinian people and the national political movement in Palestine. After the Nakba, understandably, there was turmoil and people were scattered, and the young state of Israel was very motivated and very strong with tremendous international support, and nothing really happened to try to resolve the situation. We're now into the third generation, and it's their second generation, really into the 70s and 80s, where significant advances were made in having Palestine recognized internationally. The PLO became the main representative, and it was at the UN, and people started to have dialogue, etc. We're now into the third generation, and what normally happens to the people in exile is the third generation is the one that goes back and starts thinking about how to resolve this problem and end its exile and statelessness. I think that the May-June period of 2021, 2 years ago, was the turning point when there was the Sheikh Jarrah controversy and clashes, and Jerusalem clashes, and then Gaza and Israel, Hamas were fighting each other. And that was a tremendously significant moment. And I think it turned the corner for Palestinians. So the situation we're passing through today in the Palestinian national movement and in the Palestinian community includes several trends that are all moving faster and faster now. They were kind of captured symbolically last Monday at the United Nations on May 15th, I think it was. I actually was there, I attended. The UN General Assembly had a commemoration of the Nakba in the General Assembly building, in the same General Assembly that 75 years ago voted with a majority to partition Palestine in a way that the Palestinians and the Arabs thought was extremely unfair, but it happened. The state of Israel was created. The Palestinians were either occupied or exiled. And it's symbolic that 75 years later, the UN itself, the General Assembly, would order this commemoration. And the commemoration was full of what we would anticipate, lots of speeches from people all over the world, countries all over the world, supporting Palestinian rights, a negotiated solution, peace and justice and security for both sides. But it was very symbolic that the UN itself recognized the Nakba. And the Nakba is the one word that the Palestinians chose to describe their trauma and their injustices that they felt and their rights. That one word, and the UN finally recognized it. Before, the UN used to talk about the question of Palestine, which is a little bit kind of abstract, almost very sterile. But suddenly, last Monday or 2 Mondays ago, it became the Nakba. That was also a symbolic turning point. But around society, all over North America, Europe, and much of the world, you're seeing movements, civil society movements that are organizing, mobilizing, contesting, pushing back against pro-Israeli political movements. And this is all being done peacefully and politically and publicly. And this is very different from what happened 40 and 50 and 75 and 100 years ago in the Balfour Declaration, where much of the action that created the Arab-Israeli conflict was done quietly behind closed doors in political meetings with people in Europe and North America and the Middle East and Russia and other places. So we're at a turning point where groups are challenging, Palestinian groups are organizing using the law, court cases. Now in Canada, you've had several of these professors at the University of Toronto who had raised a court case in other places, and in the United States, whenever there's an action by a pro-Israeli group, or sometimes the state of Israel funds it, but sometimes it's just tons of Israel who support it, to silence Palestinians or not allow them to have a public voice, it's taken to court. Groups like Palestine Legal and the many others that are Palestinian, supported by people like the American Civil Liberties Union, they go to court, and the courts almost always say, no, you're allowed to speak out on these issues, and you're allowed to promote boycott, divestment, and sanctions if you want, because this is peaceful protest and it's freedom of expression, which is guaranteed in the Constitution. So there's dozens and dozens of groups like this all over the world. One of the most interesting recent events that capture, again, the slow change that's going place. This is not a dramatic shift. The world hasn't suddenly become pro-Palestinian and anti-Israeli. The world is slowly but steadily moving towards a more balanced position, that Israeli security and rights have to be balanced with Palestinian security, sovereignty, and rights. The most fascinating thing happened yesterday when the United States government issued its anti-Semitism strategy, which is an extremely important strategy, and I urge everybody to read it and support it. And despite intense lobbying by Israel and pro-Israeli groups to include the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, the White House didn't. It just mentioned it, but it didn't say this is what we accept. So this is profoundly symbolic and also profoundly politically important in symbolic ways, that the Israeli government and the Zionist movement that for the past 100 years, or certainly 75, had tremendous ability to achieve its goals by creating support from governments and media and other people around the world for many reasons that are understandable why people sympathize with the state of Israel. And the Palestinians were not very good at promoting their own cause, and there are many reasons why Israel was dominant. But now that dominance is really starting to change. One other reason is that you have this extremely violent right-wing government in Israel that is creating a lot of concern around the world, and people are seeing. You can now watch on TV and on your phone, you can see settlers burning Palestinian villages, and therefore Palestinians say, look, the Nakba never ended. It's going on. People are still being expelled. 200 Palestinians were expelled out of their village yesterday because the Israeli government and settlers both have been hounding them for months and months and months. I think we're at a turning point where Palestinian society, working closely with progressive allies all around the world, are starting to make significant headway politically in blunting the pro-Israeli dominant political atmosphere in many countries around the world and policies of many countries. And this is opening the way for potentially a greater move towards a discussion about a negotiation that gives people equal rights. It's not going to be easy, after all that the settlement movement has done in Israel since 1967. But the momentum, I think, is moving in the right direction, and Palestinians are very aware of this and are pushing for more organized political action. And all of it is being done by civil society and private individuals. The Palestinian government, unfortunately, is not very competent, not very efficient, hasn't been able to take the lead, and therefore this is all being done by civil society and private individuals. The important thing also is that the Palestinians, for the first time in their history, have access to the global media. They can tell their own story. This is, again, something that profoundly erupted onto the world stage in May and June of 2021. And people were, people watched this Jewish Israeli settler from Brooklyn going to the Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah saying, "I'm going to take your house." And they say, "You can't take my house. It's my house." He said, "Hey, if I don't take it, somebody else is going to take it." I mean, when you watch that on TV, or you turn on the TV, or you turn on your social media and you watch Jewish settlers in the name of, the Jewish people going, they say it's in the name of the Jewish people. Most Jewish people, I don't think, accepted this kind of action, but people can see what Zionism and Israel are doing in Palestine, and they realize it's not very acceptable. And therefore, and I'll end with this, one of the dominant developments, which is incredibly important, is the change in the discourse on the Palestine-Israel conflict that now looks more and more at Israel as a settler colonial movement that is practicing apartheid. Those two terminologies are extremely important. And of course, the Palestinian BDS movement is trying to sanction Israel like the apartheid movement in South Africa was sanctioned. So we're seeing these little hints of progress and change and movement towards a more balanced situation that hopefully will generate some kind of response inside Israel in terms of a peace movement that recognizes the need to negotiate an end to this conflict, giving both people their rights. And it's a tough negotiation when you deal with refugee claims and restitution and land and this, but I believe it can be done. And in the second part of our discussion today, we will hear our colleagues talk about what might happen possibly in the future. So that's my analysis of where we are, where we're heading, and what are the important things to watch for.
10 minutes precisely. Congrats, Rami. Rami Khouri, who unfortunately is not related to me. I get asked that all the time. Came to us today from Cambridge, Massachusetts. Thank you, Rami. And we move next to Derek Pensler, who is in Oxford, England tonight. Welcome, Derek. Rami talked about Palestinians after 75 years. The question to you is about Israel that was born 75 years ago and has flourished into a regional economic and military superpower. Its neighbors are increasingly accepting it, peace treaties with Egypt, Jordan, normalization recently with 5 other Arab governments as part of the Abrahamic Accords. So it looks, it looks great in terms of the 75-year achievement, but all is not well. We saw recently deep internal divisions and historic demonstrations in Israel about really profound and basic issues of rights and where the country should be going. We also see the issue of Palestinian liberation is nowhere to be seen. So there are serious challenges. So the question becomes where is Israel today vis-a-vis the premise and the promise of its establishment and its declaration of independence?
Okay, there's a lot to cover in 10 minutes. Being a historian, I'll go back to 1948 and show how the background from 1948 really helps us understand where we are today. I go back to the founding declaration of the state from May 1948. which does not mention the word democracy, although it did pledge equal treatment regardless of what was called religion, race, or sex, but not nationality. And the declaration did not impede the forced exile of 750,000 Palestinians and subsequently thwarting their return. And we have to understand why. And I'm not asking people tuning in to agree with me. I'm presenting how Israelis have perceived the situation for the last 75 years. Starting in 1948, when Israeli Jews conceived of the war for Palestine and the Holocaust that had just ended 3 years previously as part of a single struggle for existence, for survival. The Jews in 1948 in Israel believed they were fighting for their very lives. They believed their backs were against the wall and they had nowhere to go. The Palestinians had the massacre of Deir Yassin, the death of over 100 innocent people, killed by Jewish forces in April 1948, which induced mass panic among Palestinians. Then there's a similar atrocity in May in Kfar Etzion, where 130 Jews were murdered by Jordanian and Palestinian fighters. And that strengthened the Jewish desire to prevail. And that sense of threat explains why during the war, Jews, they didn't differentiate between Arab civilians and fighters, or between young men and children and women. They didn't. Palestinian armed resistance was a source of existential fear among the Palestinian Jews, and that fear grew much greater once the Arab states entered the field in May of 1948. Now, the Nakba, as it happened in real time, was known to the Israelis. Of course, 1/6 of all of the people in the new state of Israel were actually in the armed forces. Of course, they knew what was happening. The Haganah assiduously documented what was happening and said it was largely due to Israeli military action. The Nakba was documented by some of Israel's finest writers, including Natan Alterman and S. Yizhar. But then after the war, the Nakba was forgotten. This was a constructed amnesia, replaced with stories of Palestinians being ordered to leave by their leaders. And simply, if we understand it from the Israeli perspective, during the 1950s and 60s, this is a country trying to absorb over 1 million new immigrants. It's building communities on the land of former Palestinian villages. There's simply no room for compassion for the refugees who are now called infiltrators. If they try to return to their own homes, they're called infiltrators. Why does this matter? In the young state of Israel, there simply was no perceived contradiction between a state formally pledged to democracy and the forced removal of 60% of Palestine's Arab inhabitants in 1948, or the military rule over Arabs in Israel until 1966, or the confiscation of hundreds of thousands of acres of Arab-owned land. Israel was perceived as democratic, and the issue with the Palestinian Arabs and with other Arabs was simply not seen as contradictory. And these images and rationalizations are with us to this very day, where fear of Arabs can blend with condescension. During the lead up to the 1967 war, the Israeli government was transmitting images of both existential threat and stoic resolve. And these feelings were reinforced from the 1970s onward by Palestinian terrorism, the word that Israelis would use, within Israel and abroad. So in a way, there's a dynamic started in 1948 that just continued on decade after decade. And ironically, it was the occupation in 1967 that instituted a brief moment of what might seem as a kind of new language of Israeli Jews who would go into the West Bank as occupiers and say, well, you know, there are good Arabs and bad Arabs, and there were unequal relationships between Israeli employers and Arab menial laborers. And there was a sense that, you know, Israelis would say, I know the good Arabs. But it was based on a position of authority. But this is precisely why the Palestinian intifadas, particularly the second one, the first one, 1987 to 1993, but particularly the second one in the first years of the 2000s, really rattled Israeli Jews. They felt shocked. They felt betrayed. They did not focus on the numbers of Palestinians killed by Israeli forces. They focused on the Israeli Jews killed by Palestinians. Over 100 killed in the first intifada and 9 times that many in the second intifada, and the suicide bombings on buses and public spaces and so forth. So many Israeli Jews saw the Oslo peace process of the 1990s as a terrible risk. And Netanyahu himself, you know, led those protests against it. So From the very beginning, then, Israel is, although it calls itself a Jewish and democratic state, it was really a Jewish democratic state, an ethnic democratic state. And when Yitzhak Rabin was killed, yes, of course, people mourned him because they saw him moving forward towards peace with the Palestinians. But I think even more of it was the shock that he'd been killed by a Jew, that this was very much a familial issue. Israeli democracy is familial. And the Palestinians really don't have a role in this, whether they should or not. We can talk about and how that role can be created. This is just the background to 2023, the judicial overhaul that the government is trying to implement, the mass protests. The principle that Israel is Jewish and democratic goes back to the 1980s, and it was strengthened in basic laws that were promulgated by the Knesset in 1992 and in 1994. The laws themselves did nothing to affect the status of the Palestinians living under occupation. They did very little immediately to help Palestinian citizens of Israel, but they blazed a trail forward towards Arab claims of equality when in 2003, the Israeli Supreme Court ruled in favor of an Arab family that wanted to acquire a home in a community hitherto restricted to Jews. So there actually was movement in Israel towards, I'd say, greater genuine Jewish and democratic qualities. And it was precisely this fear that Israel was moving to becoming more, I would say, Jewish and democratic that led to the reaction against it. So the 2018 Basic Law on Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people circumscribed democracy within Jewishness. And when the law was voted on in the Knesset, centrist and leftist members of parliament voted against it. And they were dismayed that it passed. But they didn't go into the streets. And this is the final thing I want to talk about. Why is it now Israeli Jews, by the hundreds and hundreds of thousands, are going into the streets to protest something that's been going on for years, right? The nation-state law was 2018. And it's not about Palestinians. It's not about the subordination of Arab citizens of Israel to Jewish citizens. That hasn't changed that much. It's that the pillar of Israel as a Jewish democratic state is now under attack. Legislation that would allow contravening the country's basic laws by a bare majority in the parliament threatens rights to intimacy and privacy and property and protection from arbitrary police action that were guaranteed in a 1992 basic law. Secular Jews in Israel feel threatened by religious Jews, right? This is very much, again, a kind of internal strife. A third of the current members of the parliament are Orthodox. Some of the parliament's most dynamic legislatures have agendas to inculcate into the Israeli educational system and civil society a militant Judaic nationalism. So what happens in Israel today is that more and more Israeli Jews are afraid that the country will become an illiberal democracy, which is a euphemism for tyranny by the majority. This isn't about Palestinians. And I think that this is where I feel like there's a kind of dialogue it's not a true dialogue. I feel like we're talking past each other, that the political conversation in Israel today, those people who are in the streets demonstrating week after week, they're demonstrating for a reason. The Israeli flags they're waving, though, they're bringing they're waving Israeli flags at the demonstrations. They're ritualistically invoking David Ben-Gurion. They're quoting from the Declaration of Independence. So this is rife with nostalgia for Israel's foundations, again, as a Jewish democratic state, not as a Jewish and democratic state. Now, nostalgia is a very powerful emotion, but it's regressive. And I'd say there's only pockets in the protest movement that are openly, willingly engaging in admitting that the assault against Israel as an ethnic democracy is really the long-term result of Israel's failure to develop into a liberal democracy. And that tension, that problem lies right in the Declaration of Statehood of 1948. And it's run through the country's history ever since. But we can't ignore the very real history of conflict and war and death and destruction in which Israeli Jews have been victims. Palestinians have suffered more, but Israeli Jews have been victims as well. And until and unless we can internalize that I don't think we are going to move forward. Okay, 10 minutes. I'm done.
Great job, Derek. I'd like to pick up on this last point of both sides seeing themselves as victims. Jews historically, of course, victims of European anti-Semitism, and then the Holocaust that followed, and Palestinians, being victims of the creation of the state of Israel and suffering endlessly since in the last 75 years. When you see yourself as, a victim or the greatest victim, it becomes much harder for you to, see the other's pain, empathize with the other's, own, victimhood or victimization. And that, so I was happy that you ended on that note. And I wonder how that tells us about where we go from here, about are we ever going to be able to have that kind of empathy for the other and wanting for the other what we want for ourselves? I've been impressed by the parents' circle work in Israel, where victims, parents of victims, come together and come to the conclusion that I'm going to care for your son as much as I care for mine. This is so. Any comments on that? Any other questions or comments from the other panelists? Please feel free. This is a free for all for the next 10 minutes.
I'll throw something out, which is a bit controversial, and we can take it from there, which is there's a certain orthodoxy that I feel is forming in certain civil society circles that this isn't a conflict, it's a struggle. There's one good guy and one bad guy. And I've been told that the word complexity should be banned from discussion about Israel-Palestine because some people say it's not complex, it's very clear, an oppressor and an oppressed. And I'm sorry, I do not agree. It is complex. It actually is. And it is probably the most complex conflicts on the planet. That doesn't mean that there aren't good people and bad people and that there isn't justice and injustice, but it is complicated. And I saw a comment about not two-siding the conflict. This is a conflict where there are people with different rights. And I understand how difficult it is for many people to accept that. It's supremely difficult. But unless we can, I really don't see a way forward. That's my 2 cents.
What do you mean by different rights?
Sorry?
What do you mean by different rights?
That, for example, if we dismiss the Zionist project as nothing but a form of settler colonialism, whose intentions are purely malign, this is simply both factually, analytically untrue, but it's also unhelpful in terms of thinking through any kind of resolution to the conflict other than mutual annihilation.
Well, I can tell you that the first time I heard about the whole idea of Zionism being a movement of self-determination was 16 years ago when I started talking to Jews. It's something that I had never heard before. To me, Zionism was a completely different thing, But Rami, would you like to weigh in?
Yeah, sure. There's a complex situation, and Derek has pointed out some very important and subtle points in some cases. But I share his view that, and your view, I think that the only road to a resolution is for both sides to achieve their basic rights as they define them, or as they're defined in international law, but also that will never happen unless both sides appreciate the sentiments and concerns and the rights of the other side. So, that's basic conflict resolution. Nobody's going to defeat the other completely. And we've seen that the Jewish people, after the Holocaust and the anti-Semitism of white North America and Eurasia, created their state. They did something that was, in objective terms, quite amazing. Unfortunately, they did it on land that was 93% Palestinian. So that's where the conflict is. Both sides have rights. Both sides have been victimized by different people as well. So a few years ago, about 10 years ago, I did a research paper where I asked about when I was living in Jordan after the peace treaty, you could talk to Israelis and Arabs easily, and I went back and forth. I was not a man. I interviewed, I think, 27 Israelis and 27 Palestinians and asked them basically, and they would only talk off the record because they wouldn't want to be quoted. I asked them, what is your bottom line? What would you accept for a full peace? And what would you give to the other side? And the answers were remarkable in terms of both sides showing far more pragmatism and flexibility, saying, Israelis, even people, Likudniks were telling me, look, of course we did massacres. We know we did it. We had to do it. So they tell you why they did it, but they don't deny that it happened. And the Palestinians themselves saying something similar in various ways, things like, we know we can't go back and live, all of us, in Palestine, which is Israel now, but we have to have our link to that land, our rights there recognized. So the reality, in my view, based on my lifetime, I was born in 48, and then in the next one, I spent my whole life living this. And my impression is that there is a mechanism to achieve a fair peace, but it's what Rashid Khaldi called you achieve attainable justice, not pure justice. That neither side will get totally what it wants, but they've got to get a measure of justice that they believe satisfies their most important needs. And for the Israelis, it's acceptance by the Palestinians and the Arabs, and the recognition that they have a link to that land, which historically they do. And for the Palestinians, it's a need for the Israelis and Zionists and pro-Israeli people to acknowledge what happened to the Palestinians in 48. And the Nakba started before May of 15. The attacks on settlements, the fighting goes back to the 30s and 40s. So the Palestinians need recognition. They need to be acknowledged of what happened to them and what rights they have. So I'm less pessimistic than most people are. The problem is we don't have governments now on either side who are able to do a serious peace process, nor do we have a serious international mediator. So this is completely moribund now at the moment. We have to get through the next 3, 5, 7 years, whatever it is, and hope that the wellspring of rational activism will come out of Israel and out of Palestine and Arab countries in the United States and Washington and London and other places. And of course, the British are the big culprits behind a lot of this, going back to the Balfour Declaration and things like that. So
I remember my dad's words about the Brits on every Sunday dinner we had growing up. Cannot be mentioned here publicly. Some people are saying that the volume or the sound isn't clear enough. Closed captioning is enabled. If you look at your options on the Zoom, you can actually click on show captions and be able to see the captions. Okay, we're great. We're perfectly on time, and now we will move to the second section of our work today, of our panel, and it's the future perspective. Shibli, welcome from Silver Springs, Maryland. There have been many sort of so-called solutions to what was conventionally called the Arab-Israeli conflict. Today there isn't an Arab-Israeli conflict. There is a Palestinian-Israeli struggle, as far as I can see. There has been many attempts, the Peel Commission, the 1947 UN partition plan, Oslo, all of which that haven't worked. We still do not have peace, let alone justice. Now, you co-edited a book recently titled The One State Reality, What is Israel-Palestine? If you could please explain a little by what you mean about it, a one-state reality, and what does that foretell about the future, about where we go from here?
Great. Well, thanks, first of all, for hosting me, and really appreciated the conversation. I also want to say that, of course, there's a place for rehashing the history of it, and there's more than one narrative, and it's complicated. It is complex, and it must be something that is addressed, and there's a place for that for sure. This is really not the place for me to enter into that conversation, for one thing, but it is extremely important. And when we all hope Israelis and Palestinians will find an equitable peace at some point, there will need to be a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to move forward, and all of that needs to be out there. History is important; it can't be neglected. But that's not the approach we take in our book. And it's not the approach that my co-editors and I say is the case in a current issue of Foreign Affairs, where we have an article that we co-authored, the four of us, that includes Mark Lynch, Nathan Brown, Michael Barnett, and I co-authored the article in the current issue of Foreign Affairs called Israel's One State Reality. And we start deliberately from what exists rather than with how to get here. Again, not dismissing the importance of how we got there, right? This conversation is important, but that's not what we try to litigate in the book or in the article. And our point is that we have acted, certainly in the public discourse, certainly in America, certainly in the foreign policies of Western states, as if there is the pre-67 Israel, which is a democracy, flawed democracy, but nonetheless a democracy, temporarily occupying territories. And then, we're working toward an outcome, which is the two-state solution, which is, therefore we should be patient with it. The problem with that is that, when you say temporary occupation, which is the idea of occupation, people don't have in mind lifetimes. It's been a lifetime. It's been most of a century with no end in sight, with no path to getting there. In the meanwhile, the institutional arrangements have been such that it has become nearly impossible to contemplate. And the four of us who have written the article and edited the book are all supporters of two states. We have come at it from probably before other people supported it. We were supporting it pragmatically as probably the most equitable possible outcome to fulfill both Jewish national aspirations and Palestinian national aspirations. We've written about this, all of us, at some point or another. So this is not something coming at it from dismissing that as a need. But when we examine the reality as it now exists, what we see is a single state dominating all the territories from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean. And this one state reality, as we call it, is not something we celebrate. We don't see it as a solution. We don't see it as something that we should strive to maintain. We see it as deeply unjust, highly problematic, and also unstable in the long term. And the way we examine that, we look at it through what is statehood versus what is sovereignty. I think a lot of people have looking at it through a prism of what is sovereignty. You can say Israel is not sovereign on the West Bank and Gaza, even if it has declared sovereignty over like East Jerusalem. That doesn't give it sovereignty, because what we say is state is about control. Sovereignty is about outside recognition of the legality of that control. And sure, the international community is not likely to accept the legality of the one state, but in practice, the control is very clear, because what is a state from the prism of our political science? It is the near monopoly of the use of force. It is the control of borders, control of the airspace, control of the shorelines, all of which is done by Israel. And much of what happens in the West Bank is since the collapse of the Camp David negotiations in 2000, really the collapse of the peace process as we have known it, the Palestinian Authority has become increasingly more and more of a subcontractor for Israeli security rather than independent institution. And meanwhile, you have not only the growth of settlements, but also the institutionalization of that control in so many ways in practice and legally. So we call it now, we think it's a one-state reality that we now have. If you agree that it's a one-state reality, it's very hard to stick with the same perspective that one has as a pre-67 Israel, which is a flawed democracy. It's not any worse than many countries around the world. In fact, it might even be better than many countries around the world, and a temporary occupation. If you put on a new pair of glasses and you look at it through a one-state reality, and you look at the relationship between Jews and non-Jews in the entire territory, it is very hard to escape appealing to the word apartheid. And we address that very deliberately. And if that's the case, then it's deeply unjust. It's not just illiberal, but it is much more complicated. And as Professor Pensler has said in his talks, the demonstrations in Israel have been heartening. The liberalism of Jews against the overhaul, the judicial overhaul, really important. No one should dismiss it, but it didn't touch it mostly did not touch on the critical issue of the relationship with the millions of Palestinians who have no rights, no human rights. And to think about this again, we are talking about over 5 decades where people have absolutely no rights and no end in sight and no path to an end in sight. So therefore, we then revisit not so much the blame of Israelis and Palestinians. We know that both have a lot to do with it. And this was not our point. We're all Americans. We focused largely on the role of our government. And we say very, very carefully that when you look at the history of our role in this conflict, the United States has been an enabler of this unjust reality. Without the American role, it would not have happened, and continues to be an enabler. And American policy is complicit in entrenching an unjust one-state reality that's akin to apartheid, and it continues to do so and must stop doing so. And just a couple of examples. It's one of the reasons why probably 2 states are no longer possible in any foreseeable future is the fact that you have the settlements. I mean, it's not just the settlements, but that's a big part of it, that you have 750,000 settlers beyond the Green Line. And it's hard to envision how that is compatible with a Palestinian state. These would not have happened if over and over and over again, including just under this administration, there is no shielding of any consequences for settlement building at the UN. When there are no consequences, why would anyone have any reason to stop it when the political pressure is moving to build more? It makes no sense at all. And so therefore, we call on our government to stop being complicit, even if we don't know where it's going to head. Here's what we say, though, about the possibilities. What we need to look for is an equitable outcome. And honestly, there are only 2 possible equitable outcomes. And I'm not even talking about historical justice, because as you all said, this is not a perfect world. What you look is an equitable solution that satisfies the basic needs and human dignity of both people. That's what we look for. And if you're looking for it, politically, there are really only 2 possible institutions that could provide that, either 2 states or 1 state with equal citizenship. And those are the only 2. People talk about confederation, but you have to go through 2 states anyway to get there. That's it. That's all you got. And I personally, speaking for myself, certainly would take either one of these possibilities over a 1-state apartheid, like 1 state that entrenches Jewish supremacy, where Palestinians don't have rights. And I think most Americans, according to my public opinion polls, would support a democratic Israel that's not Jewish over a Jewish state that's not democratic. So that's the choice. And therefore, while I don't think anything at the moment, we're pessimistic about the possibility of a one state with equality or two states. We argue, therefore, that what we should be doing is speaking out for equality, for human rights. And we should speak out against policies that our government pursues day in and day out that enables and entrenches this reality. And that if we do that, it'll open up possibility. It'll change the narrative. It'll change the debate in our country. It'll change the debate in Israel. It'll change the debate among Palestinians. And in the end, Palestinians and Israelis are going to be the ones who are going to have to live together, but we shouldn't be working to entrench an unjust reality that makes it impossible for them to find a path toward an equitable outcome.
Thank you, Shibli. You did well on timing as well. You're all great today. I'm going to go down in history. And Mira Sakharov from Ottawa today. I've been watching your work and for a number of years now, and I know that you love Israel and you have a very solid connection to it. But you've also has written and spoken out about the many injustices and the intolerable conditions to Palestinians of the status quo. We are sort of today at the point that Shibli just talked about. You have one camp that says two states is dead. Stop talking about it. That's just an extension of the status quo. And the other side makes a strong argument that says there's no way Israelis are going to accept to live as a minority in one state. So what are your thoughts on this? What is your perspective in terms of, how do we share this land? We haven't been able to do that in 75 years.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And thank you to all my fellow panelists. I'm going to agree with a lot of what Shibli said. I think I have maybe a different view on confederation and maybe a little bit of a different view even on the one state solution. But I would agree with Shibli's starting assumption that there is a one state reality. And so because of that reality, and here I'm going to engage with some of the commenters who've been talking about their discomfort with looking at it as two sides. I would say there are two groups, that is for sure. And whether we call it two sides, and we know that both sidesism has now been completely discredited as a framework when Trump said that there are good people on both sides after Charlottesville. So let's not think about sides. Let's think about two peoples, two groups, two separate sets of identities, and two different narratives and experiences about their history. In that context, I think we can all agree there are two peoples. In that context, I think what we need to do is look at power. And once we bring in a power analysis, we can start looking at systems of oppression, and we can start looking at who are victims and who are survivors and who are perpetrators. And in addition to looking at power, we can think about what political scientists like to think of as the unit of analysis. So an individual Israeli Jew who is maimed or killed in a terror attack is a victim. The Jewish state as a larger entity vis-a-vis Palestinians in the West Bank or Palestinians in Gaza or even Palestinian citizens of that Israeli state, the Jewish state in and of itself, or the state of Israel, is the powerful one, is not the victim. So it depends on what unit of analysis we're looking at. And once we think about both the importance of groups and the importance of individuals, we can start looking to the right legal codes and the right norms. So I look at legal codes as in the individuals deserve the right to life, liberty, and happiness. And I look at more norms around cultural nurturing and cultural furtherance. And so when I look at norms, and which are not necessarily codified in legal systems, I think about the norm to Jewish Israeli well-being and the norm of furthering Palestinian Arab well-being. So Palestinians have their own distinct culture. They have not their own unique language, but their language has very slight differences from the Arabic spoken around them. Even Gaza differs in very, very slight ways from the West Bank, and there are similarities between Gaza and Egypt. And then, of course, looking at the Maghreb, in North Africa, there's very different language systems there, though again, they're all part of a common Arab nation. So when we think about what individual groups need, I see a future where there would be two national groups, Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs, or we could just say Israeli Jews and Palestinians, whose culture is nurtured side by each and with some synergistic aspects. Does that mean a one-state solution or a two-state or a confederal solution? I would think any could go. Any would be fine, except for I think this is a little bit in the elephant in the room, because I don't think anyone's talked about refugees. The only way refugees could return and be welcomed back into their villages and towns and lands on which they lived and thrived for many years before the Nakba would be either a confederal system or a one-state system. And let me just give the confederal system a little bit of airtime, because we haven't heard much about it. And that is that the key point in a confederal system is, yes, you'd have two states living side by side with freedom of movement across the borders, which would be quite permeable. But there's one key principle which I find quite exciting, and that is the following: citizenship and residency would be decoupled, meaning a Palestinian refugee could return. We have someone here on our Zoom, on our webinar, who is from Jaffa and who left Jaffa in 1948 in April. So just remind me your name, but I'll scroll up and see it. I know the initials were two H's. You would be able to return to Jaffa. You would, though, however, be a citizen of the state of Palestine. So you would have to respect the law of the land in what is sovereign Israel, and of course, municipal laws in Tel Aviv Jaffa joint municipality. And you would vote for the parliament in the state of Palestine, whether that parliament would most likely be in Ramallah, maybe it would be in East Jerusalem in a shared Jerusalem framework. Let's leave Jerusalem aside right now. A settler who's currently a settler in Gush Etzion would live in the Palestinian state and have to respect the law of the land of the state of Palestine, but would vote for the Knesset, for the Israeli parliament, which is currently in Jerusalem, in West Jerusalem. So once you decouple citizenship from residency, you defuse the fears that Israeli Jews have about the demographics, the population numbers, and who's a majority and who's a minority. The demographic discourse is very toxic, and it's very undemocratic, and it's very illiberal. But I'm going to not shame Jewish Israelis, and diaspora Jews engage in this a lot too. I'm not going to shame them for a minute, because I'm going to acknowledge that it is born from fear, and it is born from the fear of either anywhere from cultural dissolution. What if our culture one day disappears? People want to maintain their sense of identity over time. Everything from there to actual fear of bodily harm. And so once you decouple residency from citizenship, a lot of that fear diffuses. So that's one thing I want to say in favor of confederation, though I'm not necessarily totally sold on confederation. Part of me envisions a single entity where you would have what you have right now in Israel proper, so to speak, but on a macro scale. And so what you have in Israel proper, and I'm going to magnify things a little more to among the hundreds of schools that there are in the state of Israel, there are half a dozen schools, just about 6, I can count on one hand, that are called bilingual schools. There's a charitable outlet for them in North America called Hand in Hand. And they're bilingual schools where roughly half the student body are Palestinian citizens of Israel, some from East Jerusalem who are residents, and half the student body are Jewish Israelis. And all day long, they learn both Hebrew and Arabic. There's 2 teachers in each class, not UN-style simultaneous translation. You're not closing off your ears to the other language and waiting for your own. It's done in a beautiful co-harmonious dance. I've been there and watched one of these classrooms in action. And so you're developing social links, you're developing cross bilingualism, so cross linguistic understanding. You're teaching the history and culture and holidays of 2 peoples and 3 religions, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. So I could see that kind of fanning out over time at a macro scale within a reimagined Israel-Palestine entity, even in a one-state scenario where both cultures and peoples are nurtured and allowed to thrive. And that's a little different than the one person, one state vote. I mean, there would have to be a vote per person to be a democracy, but it's not meant, in my view, it wouldn't flatten all the differences. It wouldn't simply become an American-style melting pot. It would elevate cultural differences the way Canada has between the English and French, and Canada has a lot more work to go vis-a-vis the Indigenous people. So in Israel, there's Israel-Palestine, there's only two major peoples. So they have an advantage. How much more time do I have, Raja?
2 more minutes.
Okay, so in the following 2 minutes, I would just like to say two things: one on the IHRA definition, and one on BDS, and one on Nakba. One on Nakba. We talked a lot about the Nakba, and I'd like to really flag something that I think was a very, very, very insidious form of Nakba denial, whether intended or unintended, that I unconsciously absorbed until not long ago. And that was that I knew that the Nakba was the Arabic term for catastrophe. I knew that the Nakba was what Palestinians and surrounding Arab states referred to what they called 1948. Until very recently, I had imbued the idea that the Nakba is simply a way of criticizing the founding of Israel. The Nakba is way beyond that. The Nakba is not simply a rejection of someone else or some other people's vision. The Nakba itself, we need to remember that it is the forced displacement, dispossession, and death in many cases, and in terms of dispossession and displacement, of 750,000 Palestinians who still have claims to the land, and their children do, who still have refugee status in the international community, who still have homes or properties that have never been compensated. And so when many Jews say, well, why should the Palestinian refugees return to Israel? We never returned to Europe. I mean, all my grandparents are from Europe. One of my 4 grandparents was born in Canada, 3 are from Europe. Well, many of us Jews are trying to return to Europe. Many of us Jews are getting European passports as we speak, including many Israeli Jews, so who are now viewing Europe as a possible refuge vis-a-vis their own lives in Israel. I mean, what does that say about the Jewish state having given global Jewry, diaspora Jewry and Israeli Jewry a sense of safe space? So we do want those claims. My father-in-law did justifiably get reparations from Nazi Germany until the day he died. So to say that Palestinians should just suck it up because Jews did is not only unjust, it's also very much incorrect.
Wow. Thank you, Mira. Up until the last 5 minutes, I was feeling a lot of hopelessness. But it's, your talk about, these kinds of possibilities. And I hope they are actually possibilities, because, in the end, every Palestinian wants to have access to all of Palestine, and every Israeli or Jew would want to have access to all of Israel or all of Palestine, or, the Holy Land, if you want. So we'll open the floor for questions now, and I'm going to ask my colleague Peter Larson to rejoin this group. And participants, again, please put your questions in the Q&A. And if you would like a particular panelist to respond, please say so. Peter, over to you. What have you got?
Well, there's an intriguing question that's come from a observer named Sukharov. I'm sure it's just a coincidence, but he is talking about attitudes of diaspora Jews towards the Nakba. And I would like to ask one of the panelists to respond to it and maybe even expand it a little bit. I sometimes hear the hope that old Israelis will be sort of nasty, but young Israelis will be much more open to the Palestinian dialogue or perspective. I'd like any of the Palestinians, any of the panelists, to give us thoughts on the evolution of young Jews in America and young Jews in Israel.
Can you repeat the question? Was it about?
Okay, sure. For you, it's how do you see the evolution of the teaching, the learning of young Jews in America about the Nakba? And then I spread it to the evolution in Israel as well. And why don't you take a first stab at Mira?
I'm assuming you were joking about it being a coincidence, but we're a very small clan, us Sukharovs on this earth, and this is my dad. So my dad sent me to Jewish day school, and Hassan, I just want to say thank you very much for reaching out to me, and I took your details, and I'll be in touch because I'm doing a project with my colleague Omar Dajani on Jaffa, and we would really like to talk to you. So I'm going to take your details. So my dad Max Sukharov, who posed the question, sent me to Jewish day school, and we used to talk a little about Israel, and I don't know if we talked much about Palestinians until my dad started reading some other histories that gave a different perspective from the one he and I were both raised on. I haven't done a rigorous study of Jewish day school curriculum, but I really would like to. That it is in my wheelhouse. But I do know that there is an anti-occupation Jewish group called If Not Now, and a few summers ago, one of their campaigns was to engage with the senior staff of several Jewish camps. One prominent one was the Camp Ramah network of camps, and they were trying to meet with the head of Camp Ramah to try to challenge the dominant Zionist narrative and ask the Camp Ramah camps to include more education about the Palestinian experience. I don't think they got very far, but their efforts were well known and well discussed. So I have a sense that right now, and Derek, you might know a bit more too. I have a sense that right now there is a lot of okay, you know what I'll do? I'm going to say one thing, because this is what I do know. On campuses, university campuses, what mainstream Jewish organizations are trying to say is that BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions efforts are to be viewed as anti-Semitic, and that Jews on campuses should automatically, by virtue of their Jewish identity, be pushing back. And I will say that this is very telling. My Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, Canada's Prime Minister, in 2018 gave a speech apologizing for Canada's turning away of the MS St. Louis, ship carrying hundreds of Jewish refugees from Europe, from Hitler's Europe, who were eventually sent back, to most of whom we assume probably perished. And when Justin Trudeau apologized for that in 2018, he made a speech, and one of the lines in his speech was the following: Jewish students are made to feel unwelcome on college campuses owing to the activities of BDS or BDS related activities. So these are the kinds of messages that young Jewish students are getting. The message that a non-violent attempt at resisting occupation and promoting refugee return and promoting equality between Palestinian and Jewish citizens of Israel should make you feel as a Jew unwelcome. So that, I think, is alarming, and I think we need to push back on that.
Yeah, if I may, I really like particularly this last point, Mira. But in terms of the public, we have a lot of public opinion polls, so we actually know a lot about what's going on in Israel and what's going on here. In Israel, young people are more hardline than older people. So it's the opposite of where it is in most places, including in the U.S. So we find that the younger people are more extreme in their views than the older people. And partly it's demographic, as you know, a larger share of the ultra-Orthodox among the young people. So there's that demographic. But we found, for example, in the Pew poll in 2015 in Israel, which was several thousand people, face-to-face interviews, a majority of young people said they supported expelling Palestinians from Israel. That's from even within 1967 Israel, and a large majority, I believe it was over 80%, said that Jews should have privileges over non-Jews in the state of Israel. So, the young people, that's part of the problem in Israeli society, where we talk about Ben-Gvir, but we've had a huge shift among Jewish Israelis. By the way, these percentages are among Jewish Israelis, I should say, so there is that trend. But here in America, it's actually quite the opposite, despite the pressures that Mira is actually pointing out that are important. And you have these outspoken people who are saying, we feel uncomfortable because of this language. In fact, the young people have shifted more along other young Democrats, where we have seen a dramatic shift taken place in America among Democrats in particular, and most Jews are Democrats. And Republicans have remained very much on the Israeli side, mostly because of the evangelical support, which is a substantial percentage of the Republican Party. But among Democrats, it has been a very important shift that has taken place in the polling that I have been conducted over decades, as well as more recent polls like by the Gallup organization, which showed that Democrats, especially young Democrats, sympathize more with the Palestinians than with the Israelis for the first time in their years of polling. I did a poll recently that I released in an article asking both Republicans and Democrats to identify what kind of system Israel has. And I gave them 4 options: a vibrant democracy, a flawed democracy, a state with restrictions on minority rights, a state with segregation similar to apartheid. The shocking thing is that a majority said they didn't know if Israel was a democracy. And that includes 2/3 of Republicans. And only really over 40% of the entire sample, 1,200 sample, this is a national sample by Ipsos, gave opinion. And among Democrats, those who answered, more people said it's similar to apartheid, that said it's either difflawed or a vibrant democracy. So there's a shift taking place at the Democratic level. You sense it among young Jewish Democrats. In our own polling, we don't have enough to speak of the entire Jewish population because, even when we have like a sample of 3,000, it's still American Jews typically are a little bit larger than 2% because of the way we net the data. Sometimes it's 4% of our entire sample, but it's still only, we're talking about dozens and sometimes a little over 100. So you can't generalize, but we have observed no difference in our samples between Jewish Democrats and other Democrats in our sample. We have not on the question of Israel. So as you know, most Jews do not prioritize Israel in their life. It's important to them, but it's not a top priority, just like other Americans. So I think it's very important to, despite all the trends and the one that we need to worry about, that Mira is saying, I think the truth of the matter is that there's been a shift where the young people, including young Jews, are increasingly seeing what's taking place inside Israel, Palestine through the prism of social justice, not through the prism of strategic interest or biblical prophecy, sort of more akin to Black Lives Matter kind of issue.
Thank you both. I'd like to address a question to Derek as a historian. All Jews I've spoken with who are, or I should say Zionists I've spoken with, including progressive Zionists, overwhelming majority do not want to take responsibility for the Nakba. They'd say things like, if only the Palestinians had accepted the partition plan, if only Israel the Arabs didn't attack Israel right after it was established, then there wouldn't have been refugees. And people say these things as if they know them. Can you give us some context to that? Can you sort of set the record straight on this as far as you can see it?
Well, it's something I'm actually working on now. I've just been in the National Archives in London, and I'm reading commentaries made by Jewish leaders from all over the world, communicated to London 1947, 1948. it's a very sophisticated psychological mechanism. It's a defense mechanism that these are people who are very attached to Zionism. They're very attached to what they want to be a Jewish state. And so already, this is now even before Israel's been created, and then from 1948 onward, you mentioned earlier blaming the British and how your father had some pretty angry words for the British. The one thing that the Palestinians and the Jews could agree with is that they're unhappy with the British. So basically saying that essentially Palestinian opposition to Zionism, this was very big in the mid-40s, late 40s, that's not really opposition. Those are feudal, corrupt, aristocratic oppressors of the Palestinian people who are anti-Zionist for their own selfish reasons. Because according to this way of thinking, the Zionist movement is actually a great benefit for the entire Middle East. And if only the corrupt leadership of the Palestinians were swept aside and the real Palestinian voice were allowed to be heard, then we would all get along. There was even a cartoon that I show my students, a political cartoon from 1948, that shows a Jewish kibbutznik in his shorts sitting at a fire next to a Palestinian peasant, and there's a British soldier with a gun standing in between them. So the idea is it's someone else's fault. This is a very common defense mechanism. It takes different forms in different conflicts. It's very difficult for people to accept responsibility for wrongdoing and at the same time maintain a moral attachment or an emotional attachment to a cause. It takes a certain kind of person to be able to say, as Mira is saying, yes, the Nakba happened. Yes, Israel has something to be responsible for and to apologize for, but also I have attachments to this state, right? And this, to get back to the question about university students, at Harvard, and I know my students are, I can't say they're representative of, all of the United States, my Jewish students are becoming increasingly, I'd say, unsettled, critical, aware of the complexities of Israel's history and of the Nakba. And they are reaching out. I mean, a lot of them are actually trying to reach out to Palestinian students, and they're trying to really, but what they don't want to do, and they feel like they're being required to do this, they don't want to simply then denounce Israel and denounce any connections with the state of Israel. They want to say, yes, the Nakba happened. It was a terrible tragedy. We need to make redress. We need to move forward in the ways that all of you were talking about earlier. But we also want to maintain our emotional and familial and sometimes religious ties to Israel. And many of my students are finding that very difficult to be accepted in the atmosphere of a liberal university environment. It's all or nothing. And I really wish that there were more openness to the kind of approach that they espouse, because that could really lead to some important forward movement.
Thank you. Peter, what have you got for us?
I see several questions. I will try to amalgamate them that basically come back on the theme of a binational state, one state solution. What would induce Israel or Israelis to give up their current situation? I guess any panelist who wants to take a crack at this, it seems, if I can summarize what I think I've read from several questions, given the fact that Israel has, first of all, Israelis believe they have the right to have a state, they have the moral power to keep a state, there's no force in view that can change that. Why would you think that it's even useful to talk about a one-state solution? Isn't that a waste of time? How about Rami? Why don't you give a crack at this?
Yeah, I was going to say, Rami, we haven't heard from you in a while, so.
You're muted, Rami. And please speak
Could
up
you just
loudly.
summarize in one sentence again?
Yeah, well, is talk about a one-state solution a waste of time, given the fact that Israel has all the aces up its sleeve? It has the moral conviction, it has the military power, and it has the backing of the United States as well.
Well, if you take South Africa's model, which I know Israelis and Zionists don't like, but that's an interesting situation, or Northern Ireland, you had situations in the world that seemed pretty fixed, and then they changed. And they changed over time. It took 2 or 3 generations to change. Military power, as we saw in Vietnam and Algeria and India and Afghanistan and Iraq, military power is not a determinant of anything in the long run. It is in one generation, maybe. So, the power that Israel has and exercises is not necessarily going to shape the realities on the ground for forever and ever. And we have seen change, what Chibli mentioned and Mira mentioned and Derek. I mean, what you've experienced, I've experienced it intensely in the last 40, 50 years that I've been involved with the universities in the United States and also in Israel and Palestine and around the Arab world. So people do change. They change when they learn the facts. And what's happening now is the facts are becoming more clear, both because of social media, even mainstream. Washington Post had a story today, it was amazing, about they did a forensic analysis of Israeli troops attacking people in Jenin and shooting a civilian. This is going on all the time now. So no longer is the Zionist Arabism conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, controlled in its media portrayals by groups that are favorable to Israel for various reasons, some of them logical, some of them political. And the facts are becoming more available to everybody in Israel, in Palestine, and also in the Arab world. The Arab world is run by autocrats mostly, and there's terrible things going on inside the Arab world, and those facts are also becoming more clear. So I think the one-state reality, the dominance of Israel is not something that we should anticipate can stay like this for a long time. The change is going to come by pressure from the Palestinians, from some Israelis, and from people outside, which is exactly what happened in South Africa. The critical approach, I think, is to try to talk about, I mean, one state is a kind of catchword, but if you talk about communal coexistence, you know, these are two, I remember talking to my parents, our family's from Nazareth, and they're still there in our ancestral home. And Palestine, Nazareth was not ethnically cleansed because there was a Canadian officer who refused the orders to do that, which, you know, it's one of the ways Canada used, at least a Canadian used to be very, you know, decent on the Arab-Israeli conflict. And the Canadian government's position has changed radically recently. But anyway, the changes that have happened in societies in Palestine, in Israel, and around the world are a consequence of people being aware of the reality. And the media have played a huge role in this, but so has mobilized political activism. And this, to me, BDS, the hundreds of small groups all over the place, the Palestinians in camps that I visited in the Middle East who are reconstructing their villages, they've never been there. You know, kids who are 15 years old making models of their villages, people documenting the architecture of their destroyed villages. All of these facts are Tantura now, of course, is the most famous recently now. Tantura is clearly documented. The Israelis were the first people who said it, there was a massacre, and now it's been documented. So the one state is not going to be a state where one group is dominant. And we have to, like I think most of you have said, we have to come up with better terminology about how the rights of both sides can be acknowledged. And the issue of return was mentioned, and the issue of return is crucial for the Palestinians. It's why the Oslo negotiations and the others never got anywhere. People keep saying, oh, you know, Omar gave you the best deal ever in the world. No, he didn't. He gave us a good deal, but he wouldn't deal with the refugees in a serious way. You know, 75, 100,000 might come back over 20 years. The fears that the Jews felt in Europe, even before the Holocaust, from anti-Semitism and in North America and in Russia, those fears are very real, and they're very powerful, and they drive people to do, you know, severe things. They do severe things, and they do severe things to other people. The Palestinian dispossession of their land and their subjugation, their dehumanization, their disenfranchisement, their exile, their occupation, all the things that have happened to them are powerful and enduring, and they're transmitted from generation to generation. And I can tell you just one little story. My two sons, who were raised in Amman, Jordan, and were not indoctrinated in any way. We never sat them down and said this and this. When they both went to college in the United States, and they did the same thing I did when I went to college in the United States in 66, I went. Me and my two sons, both of us went through the exact same experience simply because we're Palestinians. We wrote back to our parents. My sons wrote to me and I wrote to my father and said, Baba, please send me a Palestinian flag. I need a Palestinian flag and tell me what happened in this 47 and this and that. And that's because Palestinians overseas recognized that they were not part of those societies, even if, like me, I was born in the United States, I'm an American citizen, but you feel something's missing, which is the manifestation of your identity in a context that is credible and genuine, and that people accept you. And so resolving that need is critical. The need, whether we call it identity or nationhood or whatever we want to call it, maybe it's the sovereignty of personality, of personhood, that people have. They are who they are. They're accepted for who they are, and this is what the Israelis want. They keep saying, "We just want to be accepted." Herb Kelman, God bless his soul, used to say, "The Israelis just want they want to be told that they belong in the Middle East, that we belong here." And that doesn't mean that they control everything, but that we accept them as they belong here. They're part of this land, this history. And the Palestinians are saying the same thing. We just want to be we want the Israelis and others to acknowledge what they did to us and the rights that we have. One of the interesting things in the research I did is that most of the Palestinians, almost all of them, said, we don't expect to go live back in our villages. Some of them are destroyed, but we want to know that, we want to be acknowledged that we were thrown out of our villages. And if restitution or compensation or some other thing can be done, that's the easy part. The money part's the easy part. So that's the long answer to a short question. I think the one state, I think Shibley and his colleagues did a great service by expanding the discussion about, they talk about the one state reality. It's really communal. How do we promote communal coexistence after the dominant system, which in South Africa was apartheid, and in Israel it's now widely being called apartheid. This is fascinating, but it's not a fluke. It's because people are seeing the reality on the ground. So sorry for the long answer.
Well, if the four of you were to sit in a room for, I say, a couple of days, you'll come up with a very just and realistic solution for this 75-year-old struggle, conflict, call it what you want. I'd like to, before we sign off, make a plug for my upcoming book, written with co-author of mine is Jeffrey Wilkinson. The book is titled The Wall Between: What Jews and Palestinians Don't Want to Know About Each Other. And it will be released on October 1st of this year. And with that, I would like to thank our amazing panelists profusely for the time. They're thoughtful, they're just, and there are, human rights and freedom and equality-based thoughts. I mean, this is the only way out, folks. And the more people realize that, the better off we all are. Thanks again. We'll see everyone again, hopefully soon, in another conversation. And with that, I bid you farewell. Bye-bye for now.